Amy Goodman and Dennis Moynihan, who will be sharing their ideas about their book, which is now available in paperback, Democracy Now! 20 Years of Covering the Movements Changing America. So I'd like to introduce Dennis, and he will introduce Amy to you, though she doesn't need much introduction, I know. Dennis Moynihan has worked for Democracy Now! Since the year 2000. He is the best-selling author and syndicated columnist with King Features. He lives in Colorado, where he founded community radio station KFFR 88.3 FM in the town of Winter Park. So please give a warm welcome to Dennis Moynihan.
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. What a greeting. We just came down from Eureka, where we had a wonderful turnout in support of 4 community media institutions up there, KMUD and KHSU at Humboldt State, KIDE from the Hoopa Indian Territory, and Access Humboldt, one of the really strong public access and nonprofit technology organizations, and it's just another example. California has, of course, it's a country unto itself, as you all know, and it may actually become such a thing, CalExit. But at the heart of it is KPFA, and Amy will talk more about that. But I know we're all here to hear Amy. I'm looking forward to it, and I know you are. But as a benefit for KPFA, there's no more important institution that I can think of with its rich history and ever so present need for independent media. And I think the performance by Emma's Revolution is just another example of what KPFA brings. The intersection of art, culture, politics, journalism, and dissent. So to all the staff and volunteers of KPFA, thank you all so much. Ken Preston and Bob Baldock have always been putting on these events when we roll into town at just the last minute in order to come and help KPFA. So to those two in particular, many thanks. I was very fortunate in the first summer of Democracy Now!'s broadcast in 1996 to be in, not in a Pacifica listening area, but the show was originally carried by the 5 Pacifica stations and 4 additional community radio stations, one of which was WERU in Blue Hill, Maine. And I was working as a caretaker for a little island off the coast in Penobscot Bay. The island was owned by the family of Buckminster Fuller. Uncle Bucky, as they called him, was no longer there with us, but some of his domes and other artifacts of his life remained. But that was a very isolated kind of work experience, always on the island with the seals and the fog, but with the radio as well. And it gave me that access to a KPFA-like station was very important to my connection to the world. I didn't have anything digital at all, and a sea kayak to get to shore for groceries or to access a payphone if I needed to. So that introduction to Democracy Now!, I'm sure, inspired me and gave me direction to some activism. I ended up helping out with some of the organizing around the 1999 WTO protest in Seattle, as I'm sure many folks in this room and in your community did as well. And it was there where the juxtaposition of the incredibly well-funded incumbent corporate media and the independent media came to, with incredible clarity, was exposed. I was working with a small group with the really dismal job of doing mainstream media outreach for the direct action that blockaded the meeting. And we anticipated that the mainstream media would do a terrible job covering the protest, but we didn't want to be guilty of not making an effort of educating both the reporters and also the public at large about why people were in the streets and what was the problem, the critique of the WTO. And that we confirmed that the mainstream media did a horrible job. One of the stations, Como, was just written up in the Washington Post yesterday because they're part of the Sinclair network, and Amy and I wrote about it last week, and then we covered it on Democracy Now! Sinclair is this vast network of local TV stations, which is still how people get their news, especially if they don't have a station like KPFA to turn to. And Sinclair is just been reported in the Post, has a long-held right-wing agenda and is forcing local stations everywhere to carry this as news, this kind of, so it's a problem when Sinclair owns 66 TV stations around the country, but now with the new regime in charge and the FCC commissioner named Ajit Pai loosening broadcast ownership rules, Sinclair is going to buy up something called Tribune and firm up even more their lock on the local TV station industry in the U.S. So it's a big problem, and again, another reason why we need to support stations like KPFA. I was part of the effort to get Leonard Peltier executive clemency from Bill Clinton in 2000. That, again, Clinton abused his power of executive clemency and released cronies of his half-brother and campaign donors, but not Leonard Peltier. And in that, after the failure of that campaign to release Leonard Peltier, the Native American activist who was with the American Indian Movement. And by the way, anyone who knows that history, as I'm sure most people in this room knows that it's not a problem when there's chaos and dissent within the ranks of the FBI. The FBI has long targeted and disrupted social movements in this country. And James Comey, while he may be not old enough to have been a direct participant in COINTELPRO, certainly is part of the institution that is still active in targeting activists. So I'm not personally too upset about Comey's firing, but that's me. Yeah. But that's a digression. The point I was making is after Clinton left office, Leonard Peltier's campaign, the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, which was being anchored at the time by two very dedicated activists in Lawrence, Kansas, needed a break. So I went out there and helped keep the office going and kind of develop a strategy moving forward. This was in early in the Bush years. And in my role there, I got to speak every morning on the phone with Leonard, calling in from Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, and weekly would visit him in a capacity as paralegal, and we would discuss strategy and options for him moving forward. But as we had those morning conversations at around 8 a.m. every day, he would first open the conversation usually with a question, "Did you hear Democracy Now! This morning?" Or "Did you listen to Amy this morning?" And that's because community radio station KKFI in Kansas City, 100,000 watts of dissent in the heartland, carries Democracy Now! Live at 7 a.m. Central. And Leonard would say they had this kind of so-called recreation period in the yard, this expanse of concrete within the walls of this dismal 19th century prison. And Leonard said that despite the restriction placed on the size of the radio that the warden had imposed, he and the brothers would gather around a little radio and listen intently to Democracy Now! Before being marched off to work in the federal prison slave labor industry. So for that little hour of time, they had a connection to the outside world, to the wider world, and to the social movements that we aspire to cover every day on Democracy Now! Jump ahead 15 years later, we got a call from an administrator of a prison, I think probably an enlightened or progressive administrator of a prison, a network of prisons in the UK. And he said he was part of the educational staff and wanted to run Democracy Now! On their TV network, their closed-circuit TV system. So, of course, we immediately gave him permission, and they began running Democracy Now! A year later, he contacted us and said, "We just want you to know, after a year, we've seen a 50% increase in the participation among the inmates in our educational and vocational opportunities. And when asked why they chose to take a certain activity or class, he said these prisoners almost unanimously said it was because their interest had been sparked by something they heard on Democracy Now! And so I want to say, I know KPFA is in its fund drive, and we hear that, of course, if you're a regular listener, and it becomes something that we expect annually, and it's known that in the public broadcasting world, not everyone who listens donates. But if you can consider for a moment not only the value that KPFA gives to you personally or to those you care about, think about the people in San Quentin and in the other, part of California's strong economy is this vast prison industry, as you all know. And if you think about those people who have such limited access, there is now limited email for some lucky prisoners, but most of it's analog, it's radio, TV, very limited access to information. And I think it's well known that KPFA, in particular, Pacifica Radio, and all of its sister stations in the broader network of community media, provide such a vital link to that population. So make a contribution. I would encourage you to do what I do where I live in Denver, is to make whatever kind of size monthly recurring donation to the station of your choice, if it's KPFA or other. But make sure you think about it and understand that you're helping a lot of other people besides just yourself when doing that. Amy Goodman is such an inspiration to me. It's been a real privilege for me over more than 15 years to work with her. In the book that we have, the Diesel Books, by the way, is another strong independent media institution. There was a fear that independent bookstores were going extinct, and it seems to be not the case. And the Bay Area is one of those places where you still have many strong booksellers, independent booksellers. So please join me in welcoming Amy Goodman.
Wow. This is a beautiful church. Thank you so much for coming out. Let's celebrate KPFA together in every single way that we can. And thanks so much to Dennis Moynihan, an amazingly humble person, co-author of Democracy Now! 20 years covering the movements changing America, my partner in crime in our weekly column that we do for Hearst for King Features that goes out in mainstream publications around the country to kind of show people a roadmap back to a universe of different ideas that I think very much represent actually mainstream America. Because I do think that those who care about war and peace, those who are deeply concerned about racial and economic inequality in this country, those who care about the growing inequality overall here, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. Yes, I do have to blame Dennis for this unbelievable tour that we've been on, zigzagging across the country. I think in Seattle Town Hall was last Wednesday night, and then we were in New York at a big New School event on Friday night, and then Olympia, Washington again on Saturday. But what counts is being with you right now, is supporting independent media, is having a media that chronicles and gives voice to the resistance in this country and around the world. Just, if I could get Oh, right there. Oh, thank you. Has anyone tried this? Does someone want to, should I take cup number 1, cup number 2, or cup? Though we'll be talking about water later in the broadcast, and in this event. Though we will be doing a broadcast tomorrow morning here in San Francisco, and that's the other part of this, is that we can't do extremely early morning events because we have to do the broadcast every morning. Now, it's 8 in New York, but it's 5 in the morning here. So that's what we'll be doing tomorrow morning in San Francisco, Tuesday morning at Stanford, Wednesday morning in San Diego or Los Angeles, and the next 2 days in Los Angeles. And then we're on to Tempe, Arizona, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Houston. We've got to celebrate Houston, Texas on Saturday, and then we go on from there. But I want to talk about where we began in this trip. Dennis mentioned the event with Noam Chomsky. That was really more in the middle of what we're doing. I think he's blocked out the earlier part. But it was special, and it was in Denver. Dennis helped to start a community radio station in Winter Park, Colorado, called KFFR. We did a fundraiser for KFFR, for KGNU Community Radio, a gem in the community radio network in Boulder and Denver. Free Speech TV is based in Denver. Colorado Independent, a great website for investigative news on local issues. We did it at Su Teatro Performing Arts Center, great Latino community meeting space, performing arts center. And the next day, before we flew out to British Columbia, I went over to the Unitarian Church because a woman named Jeanette Visguera had taken refuge there, had taken sanctuary. Now, we interviewed Jeanette in February when she first jumped into the church. She was really concerned then. I mean, she's lived in this country for well over 20 years, paid her taxes, law-abiding, has 4 children. Her oldest is DACA. She's a dreamer, allowed to live, legally study here in this country. The 3 other kids, much younger, are American citizens. But she got scared because of what happened to Daniel Ramirez in Washington State. Also DACA, also a dreamer. He was arrested. ICE arrested him, and she thought, what hope do I have? She's one of 11 million or so undocumented people in this country. And she didn't want her children to become motherless, to just be taken like that. So she took refuge in the Unitarian Church. And we interviewed her. I was in the studio in New York. She was on Skype, and some of you might have seen this or heard it. But now we were in Denver, so I wanted to see her, and we interviewed her again. What's it like after 2 months to be living in a church? No matter how beautiful these churches are, it's a little bit unusual. And we sat down early Saturday morning. Dennis was filming, and she said she doesn't stop working from morning till night. She said, even though I'm in the church, it's not just people helping me. She's a big immigrants' rights activist, and she's helping people all over the country. She said, I don't take this support for granted, but she has gotten lots of death threats. So I said, what gives you hope? And she said, because I've gotten so many more letters of support, calls, people helping, so many more. And it made me think about Isabel Allende here in the Bay Area, the wonderful writer who wrote House of the Spirits and so many other books, who once said, when asked about the murderous paramilitary forces in her country, she is Chilean, she said, for every paramilitary thug, there are thousands of compañeras and compañeros willing to help. And that's exactly what Jeanette said. She said, there's so many more people who are supportive. But on that issue of the death threat, she said that she can't go outside. She could be iced, right? She could be arrested by ICE. But she said that the Denver police chief, I don't know if he came over or he called her, he said, listen, you come to me or you call me if you're threatened in any way. I've got your back. That's the Denver police chief. The Denver mayor said, he supports her. Jared Polis, the local congressman, he said he's there for her. I mean, there is a level of resistance in every level of society. Juan and I were just together at a labor event Friday afternoon, but about 2 months ago, we went downtown to a nondescript office building where hundreds of people were packed in. It was in the afternoon. And it wasn't your typical noble activists who are out in the streets. It was local elected city council members from all over the country. It was mayors, state legislators from everywhere, and they were saying, how can we provide sanctuary in our towns, hamlets, cities, California considering becoming a sanctuary state, even as the Texas governor outlaws sanctuary in Texas. And they were saying, how do we protect the residents of our community? We've worked so hard to build safe communities. I mean, this idea, when Danielle is arrested, when Jeanette, it goes into sanctuary, when Zuli and Kike, Zuli Palacios and Kike Balcazar in Vermont are taken and held for almost 2 weeks, this sends a chill through millions in immigrant communities throughout the country because they think, well, what about us? What will happen next? And what does that do? It makes us all less safe. Why? Well, if someone breaks into an immigrant's home and they would normally report it to the police, they're hardly going to do that if they're afraid they could be deported. A woman who's the victim of domestic violence is not going to report the abuse if she fears that she could be instead deported. This makes us all less safe. So, at this meeting we went to, seeing every level of society organizing resistance in whatever walk of life they're in. So Jeanette, in the sanctuary, in the basement of the church, as we spoke, her kids woke up. Roberto is 10. He's a feather of a child. He's so thin and soft-spoken. And he came out, he was rubbing his eyes. He showed me a poster that his teacher, he goes to the Denver Public Schools, speaks perfect English. His teacher made of his mother, Jeanette, beautiful lithograph featuring, focusing on her Mayan features at the bottom. It said something like, keep families together. And Roberto was going to take his 6-year-old sister, Zuri, who came out and was sitting on her mother's lap, just having woken up, on a Cesar Chavez march that day, and they would hold the poster. And Roberto, as he talked to me, as I interviewed him, his mother was sitting, and he was standing next to her, and he kept his arm wrapped around her shoulder. And he said, we're going to go out on this march today, but my mother can't come, because if she goes outside the church, she could be arrested. He said, so I am my mother's voice. And it was just so beautiful. And we went back to New York and we broadcast, Roberto and Jeanette. And a day later, Time magazine announced its 100 most important people in the world, I think it is. Jeanette Vizquera was among them. And so, of course, Jeanette couldn't go to the Time magazine gala in New York where all the glitterati were. You might have seen John Legend. His video went viral. He had some choice words for Donald Trump. But so the community had a kind of little Time gala in the church because she couldn't go outside like 2 Tuesday nights ago, and they were celebrating her. Oh, when they announced at Time, she held a news conference in the church, and she held up her 2016 tax returns. And she said, everyone feel free to take a look, and I encourage the President of the United States to do the same, she said. So that party happened in the church, and that was like 2 Tuesday nights ago, and we showed pictures of it. The next morning, Arturo Hernandez Garcia was arrested in the streets of Denver. So I know Arturo because 2 years ago, we went to that same Unitarian church where he had taken sanctuary under Obama. Right, President Obama really laid a foundation here that cannot be ignored. He came to be known, even by his closest immigrant rights allies inside and outside the White House, as the deporter-in-chief. He deported more immigrants, millions and millions of immigrants, than any president in U.S. history. So Arturo, 2 years ago, went into the church afraid he was going to be deported. He'd lived here for well over a decade, has 2 children, works with his brother-in-law. They have a tile business. And he was in the church until the Department of Homeland Security gave him a letter that said he is not a priority for deportation. He wouldn't leave until he got that. And then he felt, in good faith, he had to go. And he wanted to show other immigrants, you don't have to live in the shadows. And so he left, and he's worked with his brother-in-law for the 2 years since then. And he was taken as he went to work that next morning. Now, maybe ICE felt they couldn't get Jeanette. You know, she's inside the church, and she's getting all this attention. And so they took Arturo. So American Friends Service Committee is working with both of them. And we talked to Jennifer Piper on Democracy Now! From AFSC. She called ICE, and she said, what are you doing? You know Arturo has this letter that says he is not a priority for deportation. Why did you pick him up? And they said to her, this is a new era, and we have no priorities anymore, which is an interesting way to put it. So that's Jeanette and Arturo. When we were in Burlington, we also spoke at an Episcopal church. You might wonder why we spend so much time in churches. Maybe it's because so many people come up to us at these events and they say, I watch or listen to Democracy Now! Religiously. Maybe I took it the wrong way. I don't know. But so anyway, I'm speaking in the church, and I look over, and there's Zuli Palacios and Kike Pakasar, two immigrant rights activists in Vermont. They're major activists in a group called Migrant Justice, and they organize the dairy farmers, those who work on the dairy farms in Vermont, like 1,500 of these farms, to ensure that immigrants get fair pay and good working conditions. So it was just about a month ago when ICE picked them up on the streets of Vermont. And they were held for close to 2 weeks, only released after tremendous outcry. And there they were in the church. I recognized them because we interviewed them when they were released on Democracy Now!, but through the remote studio, so I hadn't met them before. Is the Trump administration hunting down immigrant rights activists? You go for the most prominent, and everyone else is going to lose hope because they're going to think, if you're going to get them, what hope do we have who are much less high profile? Now, interestingly, last Friday, right after the show, we learned that Arturo and Jeanette had been granted stays of deportation. Also last week, Juan interviewed Karime Andujar, who heads Undocu Rutgers, well-known student at Rutgers, and Juan now teaches at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And she is a dreamer. She's allowed to live legally, study, and work here. And she gets called by ICE. You're coming in for an interview, which can be the beginning of a deportation. Now, everyone rose up on her behalf, the university, Senator Booker, all different levels of power and officialdom. And we interviewed her, played that interview that morning that she was going in for her ICE interview. No one knew what would happen, although she got out. But look at this. Are they hunting down immigrants' rights activists? Because even though in these cases people were released, most people don't even hear that part of the story. They just hear they're picked up, and it sends this chill. Last year, Juan was honored in New York, inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame. He retired from his other DN, that's the New York Daily News, after 29 years as a columnist last year, but is staying with Democracy Now!, and he's teaching at Rutgers. And he's been such a vital and inspirational part of Democracy Now! For all of its 21 years. And when he was having these parties, I might have even been here at a KPFA fundraiser last year when we came through, because I was getting these photographs of he had so many retirement parties that everyone threw for him. One of them was the New York Daily News throwing this party from at the Francis Tavern, this historic tavern in downtown Manhattan. And I'm getting these pictures. Bill de Blasio just entered the room, the mayor of New York. Governor Cuomo just left. They hate each other, so they won't be in the same room together. Chuck Schumer just walked in, the senator from New York. And I'm going, wait a second. Where, Juan, did you fail? We're not supposed to be a party to the parties. We're supposed to be holding them accountable. Why are they all coming to celebrate you? But I decided, no, it wasn't that. They were all coming to see, to verify with their own eyes that this man who had dogged them for years was actually going to be retiring. So when Juan was inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame, he was inducted last year with Charlie Rose, Leslie Stahl, Max Frankel of the New York Times, and others, like from the Wall Street Journal and ProPublica. And so there was a ceremony in Midtown Manhattan, and New York Times had a table, CBS had a table, Daily News had a table, Democracy Now! Had 2 tables. And his speech put all the others to shame. And I just wanted to read some of what he had to say about his more than quarter of a century as a columnist. He said, "I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them. Not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference." He said, "I've tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help." He said, "I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another." And I think that very much embodies the sentiment and the mission of Democracy Now! All of these years. How important it is that there is a forum for people. You have it locally at KPFA and what we do on Democracy Now! And linking up community media around the country and around the world for people to speak for themselves. Which brings me to, and I know many of you have come out to other talks before, but I always talk about the remarkable history of Pacifica. It's so important, and we have to recommit ourselves to ensuring that this network not only survives but thrives. It is more essential than ever. KPFA in 1949, almost 70 years ago, goes on the air because a war resistor named Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camp, said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how KPFA was born in 1949, not run by corporations, as George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And that's KPFA 1949. KPFK in Los Angeles, where I'll be in 2 days celebrating at another church. All of these, the media, the churches, the bookstores like Diesel, all are sanctuaries of dissent that we must preserve and protect. But WBAI in New York, my station, first year of operation, 1960, it plays a debate between Malcolm X and James Baldwin on the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the lunch counter sit-ins. WPFW celebrating 40 years in Washington, D.C. We just did a big event for them on the night of the People's Climate March, where we broadcast for 5 hours. Yes, that was April 29th, the hottest April 29th in Washington, D.C. history. We were sweltering. There was the sit-in at the White House. I think people couldn't have possibly stood at that point after hours of marching in that heat. That was April 29th. The week before we did that 5-hour broadcast from the March for Science, same place, same time, April 22nd, Earth Day. Freezing cold downpour that march went through, and still thousands of people were there. But that night we celebrated WPFW, and on Saturday night we'll be in Houston celebrating KPFT in the Petro Metro of Houston. Went on the air in spring of 1970, and Within a few weeks, it was blown up. The only radio station in the country to be blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens, right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I thought was a good song. Now, so they get back on their feet a few weeks later, right? They go back on the air. The Klan straps 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blows it up again. So now it takes like many months, and in January of 71, they're ready to go back on the air again. Arlo Guthrie comes back to Houston to finish his song live on the air. The national media is there, and this phoenix rises from the ashes, and KPFT begins the broadcast that they continue today. Now, I don't know if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his bravest act. That's because, no, he said it was his proudest act. That's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. I think why all of you are here today. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's a native elder from Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota, or an uncle in Afghanistan, where President Trump promises to expand that war even more, sending thousands more soldiers. This war, the longest war in U.S. history. When you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it changes you. You begin to understand where they're coming from. I didn't say agree with it. How often do we even agree with our family members? Oh, happy Mother's Day, everyone. But it makes us much less likely that we'll want to destroy that person. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war. And that's why we have to take the media back. Now, and it's especially critical in a day like today, in an era like now, in the time of Trump. When this president suffers the worst, the lowest popularity ratings of any president in U.S. history at this time in his presidency, you have to become very concerned, because he's going to want to deflect attention. Whether focusing on an external enemy, Iran, North Korea, or marginalizing even further disempowered communities here at home. So what? He starts his campaign and he talks about Mexican rapists. He continually calls for a Muslim ban, and he calls the media the enemy of the people. Watch out, Marin. Media, Muslims, Mexicans. I don't know the logic that he uses, but, just looking for patterns here. But it's extremely serious. And we know because right after Donald Trump became president, he tried to issue Muslim Ban 1. And the resistance, well, first let's talk about the resistance the day after he was inaugurated, right? He has this crowd of about 180,000 people. And then the media shows the pictures, and they show that, President Obama's was bigger than his, and he's very upset about this. Oh, maybe 90% bigger, right? Not in 2009, he had 1.8 million people. Trump had 180,000 people. Actually, it was a respectable-sized crowd. It was Trump that made so much of it, and soon he was so enraged that he said his crowd was the biggest in history. But that even obscured just the next day, what happened at the same time, not 9 years before, January 21st, 2017, when what? In Washington, in the same place, at the same time, 3 times the number of people came out to resist him. And it was led by women, not only in Washington, but all over this country and around the world. Hundreds of thousands of people. And it was truly amazing. You know, Democracy Now! Was there. We did a many-hour broadcast, and then we condensed it to the show on Monday. And so many people saying, and we were playing voices from the stage, and so many people were saying, we never heard any of that. And they were there because you couldn't. You know, actually back in 1963, the March on Washington with Dr. King, most people didn't hear a speech. It was at the end. It was in the hot summer day. A lot of people had left, and the audio wasn't good. And they only learned about it afterwards. And that also here, who heard the stage? It was just the masses of people that came out. And it was not only, it was 600,000 people in Washington. Then we went to Sundance. We always cover the documentary track there. And I saw Kerry Washington, who does Scandal. And she was so exhilarated because she'd just come from Los Angeles, where she'd given a speech before. I think it was 750,000 people in Los Angeles. In Park City, Utah, it was like 10,000 people. In Montpelier, Vermont, the co-author of this book is Dennis Moynihan and my brother, a wonderful journalist, David Goodman from Vermont. In Montpelier, the state capital, the police closed the interstate. 20,000 people marched in Montpelier. They said this capital couldn't contain all of these people. And this was true all over this country, and not only in the United States, but all over the world, because what we do reverberates throughout the rest of the world, why it is so important what people are doing here resisting. And then you move to Muslim ban 1 and 2. Not my words, Donald Trump's words, right? He says this is a misnomer. You can't call it a Muslim ban, or at least he argued that to the so-called judges, right? They said, that's not what we're saying, and that's not in our arguments to the court. And the court says, no, we look beyond the 4 corners of the page. We heard you for 2 years, time and time again, use that word Muslim ban, or we will ban all Muslims. You cannot erase the tapes, even if you're not exactly Richard Nixon, right? They say if history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. No, you can't erase all the tapes, especially because of citizen and non-citizen journalists who are taping as well. Now, and so thousands went out to the airports. Immediately, Donald Trump is asking, from those protests to the tax protests, show your tax returns. He's saying, who's paying them? That's his big question, because it's the only way he thinks. He projects, because when he announced for president at Trump Tower, he paid actors to be there to applaud him. At the People's Climate March, a guy came up to me and said, I'm a professional protester, but I'm doing this pro bono today. But thousands of people spontaneously, right, at JFK. I was just speaking in Chicago, and I said at San Francisco Airport, at LAX. They said, wait, at O'Hare, we were there. In Dulles, a judge and a senator were manhandled by security. It was just an outpouring of the best of humanity in this country. From Donald Trump firing the FBI Director James Comey, the investigatee firing the investigator. And whatever you think about James Comey, it's very clear what Donald Trump is trying to prevent right now, stem the spreading possible investigation into his campaign and administration. But when the first ban he tried to put into effect, banning refugees from 7 majority Muslim countries, and the Washington state federal judge stayed that ban, and he called him a so-called judge. Then they attempt Muslim ban 2, and a federal judge in Hawaii stays that. It wasn't just Donald Trump. Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General of the United States, says on a right-wing radio talk show 2 weeks ago how is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States? Now, I think the whole country is engaged in a nationwide civics lesson, from kindergartners to fifth graders to the entire country, about the three co-equal branches of government, right? The executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And I just think that Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions should participate as well. Learn about the structure of our government. We do not achieve democracy. We have to fight for it every day. And it is very clear we have to fight for it ever more and ever harder right now. So you have the Muslim bans, you have the protests around them, you have the tax return protests, extremely important. Because when the president decides to do something, we have to know, is it for his own personal benefit, or is it because of some logical foreign policy initiative? I mean, when he called Turkish President Erdogan to congratulate him on pushing through this referendum that almost all of Europe had condemned him for, not to mention so many of his own people, that would extend his dictatorial powers, allow him to stay in office for how many more years? It's President Trump who calls him to congratulate him. Now, did he do this because he has twin Trump towers in Istanbul? This is why we have to know, so that we stop suspecting. When he bombed the Syrian air base, attacked the Syrian military with those 59 Tomahawk missiles made by Raytheon, did he do it because he profited, because he has investments in Raytheon, which, according to the latest documents, he does have? Or was it for another reason? It matters. And is it him profiting? It is his family. And normally you wouldn't have to talk about someone's family, except that his family are his closest advisors and they are his business associates. So it is, to say the least, fair game and absolutely critical that we know all of this. Well, the protests have continued. The resistance has been fierce. And it is every level. And that is what is so important right now. And we need to have a media that gives voice to all of this. I do think the media has stood up to President Trump. We haven't seen anything like this in a very long time. You know, they're starting to sound sometimes like Democracy Now! You know, the media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society, right? They are saying this. But it is because Donald Trump is hitting them so hard, like every 10 minutes, calling them out, either personally or their institutions, talking about the failing media, fake news, fake news. It takes one to know one, right? I mean, let's not forget that this man was the leader of the birther movement for years, saying he had the evidence that President Obama was not a legitimate president of this country because he wasn't born in this country and he was a secret Muslim. Now, that secret Muslim part is extremely difficult to deal with because you're supposed to say, no, don't worry, he's not a Muslim. You know, put your own religion into it. No, don't worry, he's not Jewish. He's not a Hindu. No, he isn't Christian, don't worry. But, I mean, there is just a truth about this. And as for whether he was born in the United States, it is the othering of a person that Donald Trump felt, you know, he doesn't look like him. So could he really be from this country? And it tapped into this white supremacist, white nationalist movement in this country. You know, I told you the story of KPFT. It's all of our history, Pacifica Radio, but that's a story about history decades ago. Can you believe we are talking about the Ku Klux Klan today? It is very reason why they endorsed Donald Trump. The reason David Duke endorsed was this history of the birther movement. I've got the evidence. I've got the smoking gun. I sent investigators to Hawaii, of course, like his tax returns, never showing them. But it sent a very important message to this country about the marginalization of people. And there is plenty to criticize President Obama about. He says he's going to close Guantanamo. It's, for his entire 8 years, he didn't do it. Expanding the wars in the Middle East and the drone wars to a level we've never seen in Somalia and Yemen and in other places. I mean, the deporter-in-chief, right? Deporting millions of immigrants. But that he's not a legitimate president of this country. So Trump attacks the media as fake news, as failing news. They stand up. I don't even want to say this publicly, but I've always thought if he just stopped attacking them for 2 or 3 days, the media would wrap their arms around him. And it always shocked me that he doesn't stop. They would be his best ally, as they always have been for those in power. But he's hitting them so hard they have to defend themselves to a certain extent. And it has been very important, except when it comes to war. If you look at even what Donald Trump has done, the bombing of the Syrian air base, which Syrian military used the next day, the dropping of the largest non-nuclear bomb in world history a few weeks into his administration. That was in Afghanistan. I mean, that Moab, the mother of all bombs, dubbed that by the Pentagon, massive ordnance air blast. Its air blast radius is like a mile. Developed under President Bush. He didn't dare use it. Under President Obama, didn't use it. But Trump, in a few weeks, drops this bomb. For what reason? And when he did this, when he did it in Syria, the press, all of a sudden is saying, that's when he became president. And we see this for so many years. Look, weapons of mass destruction, the media acting as a conveyor belt for the lies of the administration, and why it matters, because the lies take lives. The media circles the wagons around the White House. And this has to be challenged. This is the time we have to ask the most serious questions. It was a few days after he was inaugurated that he authorizes this Yemen raid that kills over 30 Yemeni men, women, and children, and a U.S. Navy SEAL. And when the Navy SEAL's body was brought back to Dover, President Trump goes, the family of the Navy SEAL goes, and the father of the Navy SEAL says, I don't want to shake his hand. I don't want to see him. Why did he do this? But this is where President Trump understands the media will back off, which is why it's extremely frightening when he wants to escape the criticism or deflect attention, what could possibly happen in this country. But I want to talk about the role of the media in the way the media doesn't talk about it, as the exception to the rulers. Very important. That is our job, not just the exception to Donald Trump. Our job is not to be a party to the parties. David and I, my brother, also wrote this book called Static, and we called it that because in this high-tech digital age with high-def television and digital radio, still all the media gives us is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is a dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. The standoff at Standing Rock, one moment of it, I mean, it certainly has centuries behind it, but this latest development of it began on April 1st when a woman named LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who is the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, opened her property in North Dakota along the Cannonball River to the resistance. The resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline owned by Energy Transfer Partners. So many people came so quickly to her property that it was overrun, and they had to build more resistance camps, like the Red Warrior Camp and others. This was going on for months, and think about when these months were. They were in the midst of the 2016 election. How often did you hear this issue raised? Now, the Dakota Access Pipeline, they refer to as the Black Snake, snakes its way from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota, taking the fracked oil from those fields through South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, and then hooking up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Native Americans, the Standing Rock Sioux, said no. Well, they weren't alone. The people of Bismarck, North Dakota said no. And so this private corporation that's going to say the least, affect all of these communities respected that. The people of Mandan, North Dakota said no, so they didn't route the pipeline there. And the Standing Rock Sioux said no, but they weren't so lucky. And so they began to resist, protest. Many got arrested. They don't call themselves protesters. They call themselves water protectors, because the pipeline would tunnel under the Missouri River, which is the longest river in North America, and would affect, they feared, could pollute the water of 17 million people downstream, native and non-native. And so more and more people were getting arrested, engaging in civil disobedience. Reporters are not raising this in the national media. In fact, in the general election, in those debates that were the moderators, I don't call them as much journalists as media personalities, did one of them raise in one of these debates the issue of climate change? I mean, let alone the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance, climate change, the issue of the fate of the planet, which is at the heart of why the Standing Rock Sioux care about this, saying we must not depend on a fossil fuel economy. It will do us all in. We must turn to a sustainable existence that is not based on fossil fuels, but on renewables. And that's the message that they've been putting out all over. So we went to North Dakota Labor Day weekend. I mean, that was late too. We should have gone earlier. We were covering it earlier, but we weren't on the ground there until then. And we went there on a Friday. A judge was about to rule the following week. And that week, he asked for a map. The Standing Rock Sioux said this would pollute their water and would destroy their sacred burial grounds. So he said, all right, give me a map, prove it. And so they gave him a map, and they mapped out where those sacred burial mounds were. And they gave it to the judge, and he gave it to Energy Transfer Partners. And then he's going to rule the next week. So we got there on Friday. I mean, covering these protests was amazing. We're walking on the back rural roads, prairie roads of North Dakota. Hundreds of people walk. They often begin with a water ceremony, and sometimes will carry glasses of water, and they are met by a fully militarized sheriff's department. They've got MRAPs, they've got tanks on these rural back roads, and you'd have the native elders putting out the glasses of water, offering them water, saying, this is for you, not just for us. We are protecting the water for your children, not just for ours. And being met by the full force of these departments. You know it from Ferguson. The media did cover Ferguson, and you saw, you have an 18-year-old African-American teenager about to head off to college. He's gunned down by a white police officer named Darren Wilson, Michael Brown. He's corpse laying in the baking hot sun hour after hour, infuriating, horrifying the community. The community rises up, and they are met by this fully militarized police department in Ferguson and the surrounding police departments. And when journalists actually covered this and they themselves are inhaling the tear gas, this becomes a national story. I mean, look at what is happening to our police departments. This is what's recycling in America today. You take the military hardware from Afghanistan and Iraq and you give it to the police departments of this country. Mon and I had Norm Stamper in the studio a few weeks ago, the former police chief of Seattle, the one who was ousted after the Battle of Seattle, after that police uprising. That's really what it was. I mean, you had, in 1999, High schoolers, teachers, nurses, doctors, lawyers, Teamsters, environmentalists, saying no to the World Trade Organization that was meeting there in the largest export city in the United States. And they said no. And they were saying no to the supranational organization run secretively by corporate bureaucrats that could overturn the laws of democratically elected legislators. And they said no. And they were met by this militarized police department. They used so much tear gas on the people. I don't think I've stopped coughing since then. On the people that Stamper had to go out to other states to get more gas. And the rubber bullets. I remember when CNN said there were no rubber bullets used because they were repeating the lie of the police department. But indiemedia.org was showing photographs of people holding handfuls of these rubber bullets. And so indiemedia.org got more hits than CNN.com, and it really was the birth of the independent media movement as we know it today. Stamper was ousted after the Battle of Seattle, as he should have been. He was in our studio a few weeks ago. I mean, he says that this was the worst mistake of his life. They were so militarized, he said. You know, these robo-cops is what they become. He said that we see everyone outside as the enemy. And he said, instead of seeing them as our children, as our teachers, our librarians, the nurses and the doctors, our neighbors, he said. You know, you give someone a hammer and everything seems like a nail. And now he is a spokesperson around the country for police reform. Never assume a person's position will determine, you know, how they will feel. And so this is what the people of North Dakota faced, and they still protested. And that weekend, Labor Day weekend, before the judge ruled, we're covering the protests, and the next day on Saturday, there was going to be a ceremony where they the Native Americans put their native flags in the area they designated as their sacred burial grounds. So we followed them. We were filming them. I was there with my colleague, Laura Gottesdien, our producer at Democracy Now! She's here. She just flew in because we'll be working on the show all week. Our videographer, John Hamilton, who hails from KPFA and was there for so long, is a producer at Democracy Now!, and Dennis Moynihan. And we went there. We were filming this. The people who came up on this particular site did not expect the bulldozers to be operating. It was a holiday weekend. They didn't think DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, would be excavating, but they were. The bulldozers were operating at full tilt, and the people were horrified. This was the area they designated as their sacred ground, and they believed that, you know, the judge that had given the map to Energy Transfer Partners, the bulldozers had been way down the road. They believed they leapfrogged to this place to destroy it so that when the judge ruled the next week, the facts on the ground would have changed. It would be a moot point. And they were furious. And they came up on the land, and it was women with their children, it was men, it was boys, girls, and they all came. And more resistors came from the camps. And they tried to make the bulldozers stop. I mean, the bravery of this act. These are massive machines. And to stand in front of one of them that is churning up the earth, as we're filming, I could only think back to 2003, March 16th, 2003, 3 days before the U.S. invaded Iraq, in another part of the Middle East, in Gaza, in Rafah. A young American student, Rachel Corey from Evergreen College, went to Gaza with the International Solidarity Movement, befriended, among others, a Palestinian family, a pharmacist and his family. And when the Israeli military bulldozers came to demolish his house, she and other activists donned those orange fluorescent vests that construction workers wear to try to stop the bulldozers. And she stood in front of this bulldozer, and she was crushed to death. And that's what I thought about when I saw these women standing in front of the bulldozer, but this time they succeeded. The bulldozers actually pulled back. And it was amazing to see, and the people kept moving forward, and more people kept coming. One bulldozer pulled back, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed dogs, attack dogs on the Native Americans. And they were biting them, and we were filming, and sometimes you'd see some of the dogs even pull back, and they would throw them into the crowd, and they would bite their way out. It was terrifying. We filmed people who were bleeding, who'd been bitten. We filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. That day, the day of the dogs, we interviewed Winona LaDuke, who said, she's from the White Earth Reservation, indigenous rights activist and leader. She had pitched her teepee at the Red Warrior Camp. It's painted with endangered animals all over the teepee. And she said, Governor Dalrymple, that was the North Dakota governor at the time, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama 1965. We are through. So we uploaded this video of the attack dogs, even though ultimately the people forced the excavators back, the company back. They were injured. They were hurt. And we filmed, meaning the water protectors, we posted this video online that night on Facebook. And within 48 hours, there were like 14 million views. This gives the lie to the corporate media saying, people aren't interested in climate change, so why would we cover it? I mean, the intense interest and concern. The next day, we went back to New York. We had to continue doing the broadcast, and we continued to investigate this. The tape led to, among other things, the North Dakota Inspection Board investigating the use of these dogs, and they found it was illegal, and they were not licensed, and they came from a unlicensed kennel in Ohio. So that week went on, and that was the week President Obama was in Asia, and he made this historic trip to Laos. And at the end of it, he held a democracy forum for young Asian students. They came from all over, and at the end of this forum, a young woman raises her hand from Malaysia, and she says, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? Right, no American journalist had asked the president publicly about the Dakota Access Pipeline, even though we are talking about an epic struggle, the largest unification of Native American tribes in decades in this country, from South America, from the United States, from Canada, First Nations. We'd never seen anything like this in many, many years. And it took this young woman who'd come to a forum to learn about democracy from the President of the United States to ask the question. And President Obama held forth. He was eloquent on the oppression of Native Americans over centuries. And he then did address the Dakota Access Pipeline. He said, I'd have to get back to my team on it, something like that. And he came back that week. This is the week after Labor Day. And he reportedly saw the video of the attack dogs. And it wasn't lost on the first African-American president of the United States, the significance of those dogs. So on Friday, the judge ruled. No, Thursday night, Governor Dalrymple called out the National Guard. It didn't look good for the tribe. And the authorities quietly issued an arrest warrant for me. Now, I didn't know that at the time. So Friday, at around 5, the judge rules. And it is a routing of the tribe. It was terrible. Justice Department lawyers prevail over the tribe. They're about to pop their champagne corks. And then an unprecedented 3-agency letter from Interior, Justice, and the Army Corps of Engineers said they're slowing down. They're going to review all of this. They may not move forward. They may not grant the final permit to tunnel under the Missouri River. They want to see if Native Americans had input, if there was an environmental impact statement. I mean, the Native Americans are now, it's like whiplash. First, the worst decision ever, and then 15 minutes later, oh my gosh, maybe this is not going to happen. Maybe the resistance had won. Now, we had gone to Canada that day. I mean, we weren't fleeing, but my colleague and co-host Nermeen Sheikh and I had been invited to speak after the premiere of a new film on the muckraking journalist I.F. Stone, right, who told young journalists, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. And if you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And that's the name of the documentary, All Governments Lie. And it also talked about modern-day independent media like Democracy Now!, like Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone. So Matt came up with us. And I thought it was important to go because people care about First Nations in Canada. We just come from North Dakota, could talk about what was happening in Toronto. So we spoke after the film. Next day, invited to the University of Toronto, gave our speeches. And I'm giving my speech. Oh, dear, I have a lot of text here, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm giving my speech, and a text comes in the middle of it. And it says, you're under arrest. No, I mean, it said something like, there's an arrest warrant for you. And I go, but I mean, I didn't say what I was reading. I didn't know if it was a scam, but I did see a North Dakota number, and so this did not look good. It turned out it was a North Dakota lawyer. So I'm trying to give the speech, thinking about something else at the time I'm giving the speech, because I don't want to say this right away. I have to think this through, right? I mean, if there's an arrest warrant for you, you're not necessarily picked up right away. But if you have interaction with the police or with the FBI or with border agents, and they see there's an arrest warrant for you, you will be picked up. And I had to go over the border. And I was thinking, you know, could they stop me from going back to my own country? And meanwhile, I'm giving a speech as I'm thinking of all this. And thinking, well, what if the arrest warrant isn't in the system yet? I didn't know they had issued it on Thursday. So I just said, could someone call me a cab? And I went to the airport, caught an earlier flight, and I thought, if I can get over the border before they figure all this out. And I did, and I got back to New York. And, you know, I didn't take the arrest warrant personally. I really did think it was a message sent to all journalists, do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we had to go to North Dakota. So, and I also felt it was really important for young independent journalists to get the message that, you know, they can't afford, if they think this is an important issue and they want to race off to North Dakota to cover this, they can't afford to get arrested, to go to jail. They don't have the resources, the institutional backing. And I wanted to let them know you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. So we returned to North Dakota a few weeks later, flew in on a Friday to Bismarck to call the bluff of the prosecutors. And as we landed, the prosecutor announced that he'd be dropping the charges against me. But he would charge me with new charges, more serious, for which I could face a year in jail. Riot? Like I'm a one-woman riot? What is he talking about? And you know, I call my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, what is he talking about? I mean, what's going to happen now? How does this work in North Dakota? And he said, well, on Monday at 1:30, you're going to be arraigned. So it was Friday afternoon, and I'm going to be arraigned at the courthouse Monday at 1:30, so we have 3 days to cover the protests. Well, at least 2. But also I said, but is there anyone who could intervene at this point, that I would have to actually go to court and face this ridiculous charge? He said, no. I said, there's no one. There's no one who's involved in this before. He said, well, there's the judge who rubber stamps this, but they rubber stamp all the charges before arraignment. And they do that for everyone. They use their discretion afterwards when there's a trial or whatever. So I said, wait a second, there's a human being who's using their discretion. That's what separates us from the animals, right? They're using their discretion. What's the judge's name? And so he said, no, it's not. What's the judge's name? So we issued a press release naming the judge and saying he would decide by Monday at 1:30 whether these charges would hold and whether I would be arraigned. So we covered the protests through the weekend, and then the show must go on. We had to do Democracy Now! Monday morning, and we were in North Dakota. We do it at 8 in the morning live in New York. That's 5 in the morning here, but it's run at 6 and 9. And in North Dakota, that's 7 o'clock. So We brought in a broadcast truck from Minneapolis, and we broadcast across from the Mandan courthouse and jail, where I'd have to turn myself in right after. And so the backdrop, we broadcast from a church property across the street. So the backdrop was the courthouse, the jail, and the Ten Commandments in between. And you should go back to the show. If you listened, you can watch it now. It was very interesting. I mean, we're in front of the Mandan jail, where so many hundreds of Native Americans have been arrested and jailed by guards who said no to the pipeline. I mean, this is what's so important. This whole community said no to the pipeline, and they didn't have to deal with it. And the Native Americans were saying no to the pipeline in their area, and they're being held and jailed by people who certainly understood their sentiment. But so we interviewed, I started with Dave Archambault, the chair of the Native American tribe, the Standing Rock Sioux. He's the 45th tribal chair of the Standing Rock Sioux. Like Donald Trump is the 45th president of the United States, he's the 45th chair of the Standing Rock Sioux. And I said, have you ever been arrested? And he said, well, only once, a few months ago, doing civil disobedience. And he, got low-level misdemeanor charge. And I said, so what happened? And he said, I was strip searched. I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. The chairman of the tribe was strip searched and put in an orange jumpsuit. I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, who is the reservation pediatrician. She cares about the health of the kids, so she was one of the first to be arrested. Low-level misdemeanor. She's strip searched. She's put in an orange jumpsuit, and she's jailed. I mean, how much humiliation can a people take? One of the times I was at the airport in Bismarck, a guy came up to me. I was reading a magazine. He said, don't think I don't know who you are. And I said, well, who are you? And he said, I'm one of the guards who was at the site Labor Day weekend. I said, oh, really? Did you unleash the attack dogs on the Native Americans? He said, no, I didn't, and I didn't know that was going to happen. He said, we were horrified, too. He said, Dakota Access Pipeline hired a number of security companies. We didn't know they were bringing out dogs. And he said, you don't think I get it? We sick dogs on them after massacring them for hundreds of years. You don't think I understand why they're angry? Never assume, based on a person's position, what their position actually is. So we finished the show, and hundreds of Native Americans are coming to show support, to perform ceremonies there, lining up where our broadcast was on the church property. The police are lining up on across the street in front of the courthouse and the jail. The media is really paying attention because a journalist is about to be arraigned, arrested, not clear what. I mean, who is doing stories? The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Al Jazeera. It was on the BBC homepage for the world. Vogue magazine. I have to spiff up my act. So I get a call right before the 1:30 arraignment, and it's a host of North Dakota Public Radio who's been there forever and knows all the players and says the judge won't sign off on the charges, you're not going to be arraigned. And also, Native Americans who were going to court that day facing felony and misdemeanor charges, a number of them had their charges dismissed. This is what happens when the media spotlight shines in the right direction. I am all for reality television, just not the way they do it, but showing the reality of people on the ground. So let me jump this forward to December 5th, when a second three-agency letter is issued under the Obama administration. They say we're not moving forward. Either it's going to be rerouted, this pipeline, but we're not going to give this permit to go under the Missouri River. We're going to continue to evaluate this. And then Donald Trump is elected president, and one of his first acts in office is to grant the permit to drill under the Missouri River, to finish the pipeline, and to revive the Keystone XL. I mean, what we're facing in Washington is an oligarchy, right? You've got Rex Tillerson, who is the Secretary of State, former CEO of ExxonMobil, the largest private oil corporation in the world, that covered up the climate change for decades. They did the best research on it. They hired the best scientists. They exactly knew, and they covered it up. I was just covering the People's Climate March. I interviewed Maura Healey, who's the Attorney General of Massachusetts. She's suing Exxon, as is Eric Schneiderman, the AG of New York, and you had Kamala Harris, who was formerly AG here, and they're all suing ExxonMobil. And then you have Scott Pruitt, who is the former Attorney General of Oklahoma, right? This land of earthquakes that hardly knew one before, but now where fracking is so pervasive, the quakes, and his suing the EPA 14 times to try to eviscerate it, and now he's the head of it. And then you have Governor Perry, the former governor of Texas, who, when he ran for president twice, was bankrolled to the tune of $6 million by Kelsey Warren, the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access Pipeline. And when Governor Perry stepped down as governor, he immediately went on the board of Energy Transfer Partners, only stepped down to become Secretary of Energy. These are very powerful forces. And with all the tweeting and what's going on in Washington right now, make no mistake about it, they are moving so fast, led by Donald Trump, to eviscerate the regulatory state. That may sound bureaucratic, but it isn't. It's about the water we drink, the air we breathe, the land we live on, the community that we love. They are trying to take it apart piece by piece. Yes, they occupy very powerful positions, but all of you, together with people all over, also do. In fact, a far more powerful one. And I just wanted to end by saying, at the People's Climate March, at the March for Science, people were holding all these signs like, oh, IceNet has no agenda, it just melts. There is no Planet B. People were holding up signs, I'm with her, with an arrow to Mother Earth. And they were wearing buttons that said science, not silence. And it made me think back to World War II, and this is where I'll end, and where I started, where Pacifica started, right? But this was in Germany. This was a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. But they said, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? Together with their professor and other students and workers, they formed the White Rose Collective, and they decided they put out pamphlets so that the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And they issued something like 6 pamphlets, and on one of them were written the words, "We will not be silent." And they distributed them everywhere under cover of night, under cover of darkness, in alleyways, in marketplaces, in schoolyards. And then Hans and Sophie were caught with their professor. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of all of us today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now! Thank you. Thank you.